Jamaica in 1831 was a sugar machine built on human suffering. Out of a population of 300,000 enslaved Africans, the island maintained approximately 12,000 white plantation owners and overseers. That's a ratio of 12 to 1, which meant every white person on the island lived with the constant awareness that they were vastly outnumbered. The sugar plantations that made Jamaica one of Britain's most valuable colonies required endless labor during harvest season, when the cane had to be cut and processed quickly at its peak ripeness, or the entire crop would be ruined. The work days stretched to 12 hours, sometimes longer during the harvest. Men wielding whips oversaw every aspect of production. Missionary Henry Bleeby, who witnessed these conditions firsthand, described watching a man receive 50 lashes simply for allowing a mule to wander off. The punishment was administered with a cart whip, 10 feet long, an instrument he called one of terrible power. This was the world Samuel Sharpe was born into around 1801. The historical record offers only fragments of Sharpe's early life, as was typical for enslaved people whose existence was documented primarily as property rather than as human beings. The slave registers from 1817 list a 12-year-old boy named Archer on a plantation owned by Samuel and Jane Sharpe in St. James Parish. Enslaved people often carried two names, one used in official records and another used among family and friends. This boy, Archer, was also known as Samuel Sharpe, taking the surname of his owner as was the custom. The registers show his mother as Judah Bligum, and he had siblings named Joe and Eliza. By 1832, when the register recorded his death, he was identified as Archer, also known as Samuel Sharpe, son of Eve, which suggests the complexity and inconsistency of record-keeping for enslaved people. His parents had been kidnapped from Africa and transported to Jamaica sometime between 1787 and 1801, making Samuel part of the first generation born into slavery on the island. What set Samuel Sharpe apart from many of his peers was his education. In most slaveholding territories in the Americas, teaching enslaved people to read and write was explicitly forbidden. Jamaica operated somewhat differently due to the prevalence of absentee plantation owners who lived in England and managed their properties from afar. This created a need for some enslaved and free people to be educated to assist with plantation management and community tasks. Others received education through their involvement with churches. Samuel Sharpe somehow gained access to this forbidden knowledge. He taught himself to read and write, then used that literacy to consume newspapers, abolitionist literature, and, most importantly, the Bible. This access to the written word gave him something plantation owners feared above all else: the ability to understand what was being discussed in the British Parliament thousands of miles away regarding the future of slavery itself. The Baptist Church provided the framework through which Sharpe could transform from educated enslaved man into community leader. The Baptist missionaries who arrived in Jamaica in the 1820s operated under instructions from their society to avoid discussing slavery or disturbing the established social order. But the Baptist faith itself contained a contradiction that enslaved people understood better than the missionaries perhaps intended. The church welcomed enslaved people as full members and even recognized qualified individuals as preachers. This was radical in a society built on the premise that black people were inferior and incapable of spiritual or intellectual leadership. Thomas Burchell, an English missionary who arrived in Montego Bay in 1824, established the Burchell Baptist Church and appointed Samuel Sharpe as a deacon. This position gave Sharpe something extremely valuable in a slave society: legitimate mobility. As a deacon, he could travel between plantations under the pretense of spreading Baptist teachings and conducting religious meetings. Religious gatherings were among the only permitted forms of organized activity for enslaved people, and Sharpe used these meetings strategically. His fellow enslaved people recognized his exceptional qualities. They called him Daddy Sharpe, a term of respect and affection that acknowledged his wisdom and leadership despite his relative youth. His oratory skills were remarkable. Henry Blauby, who heard Sharpe preach, described being amazed by the power and freedom with which he spoke, noting that Sharpe seemed to have complete command over the feelings and passions of his hearers. Sharpe's message was both simple and revolutionary. He read the Bible and interpreted it through the lens of his own experience. His conclusion was straightforward and devastating to the foundations of slavery. In reading my Bible, he later explained, I found that the white man had no more right to make a slave of me than I have to make a slave of the white man. He quoted Scripture constantly, particularly the passage about no man serving two masters. This became a rallying cry among the enslaved population, a theological argument against slavery that was difficult for Christian plantation owners to refute without revealing their own hypocrisy. By 1831, Sharpe and the enslaved people of Jamaica were closely following developments in the British Parliament, where the abolitionist movement had been gathering strength. The transatlantic slave trade had been abolished in 1807, ending the legal importation of enslaved Africans to British colonies, but slavery itself continued. For 24 years, enslaved people in Jamaica and other colonies lived with the knowledge that the trade that had brought their ancestors in chains was now illegal, while their own bondage remained intact. Newspapers arriving from London carried reports of parliamentary debates about full emancipation. William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and other abolitionists had been campaigning for decades, using moral, religious, and humanitarian arguments to sway public opinion. Evangelical Christians, including many Baptists and Methodists, argued that slavery was fundamentally incompatible with Christian teaching. The enslaved people of Jamaica absorbed this information through whatever means they could access: newspapers, conversations with sailors and ship workers, reports from literate individuals like the Sharpe, who could read and interpret the news. Into this atmosphere of rising expectation came a rumor that would change everything. In late 1831, Thomas Burchell traveled to England for medical reasons, his health suffering from the harsh conditions and demanding work. Among the Baptist congregations in Jamaica, word spread that Burchell would return carrying documents signed by King William IV, granting full emancipation to all enslaved people in British territories. The rumor was specific enough to seem plausible and aligned perfectly with what enslaved people desperately wanted to believe. They convinced themselves that the king himself, that distant figure of ultimate authority, had decreed their freedom. They believed that the Jamaican governor and plantation owners were deliberately withholding this emancipation order, defying the king's will to preserve their own economic interests. Additional rumors made the situation even more urgent. Stories circulated that plantation owners, facing the loss of their enslaved workforce, planned to join Jamaica to the United States as a slave state, thus postponing emancipation indefinitely. Even more frightening were whispers that planters intended to kill all enslaved men and keep only the women and children in bondage. Samuel Sharpe began planning what he envisioned as a peaceful general strike. His strategy was carefully thought out, and reflected his intelligence and understanding of the plantation economy. He chose the Christmas holiday period for the action, when enslaved people traditionally received a 3-day break from labor. More importantly, he timed it for the sugarcane harvest, the most critical period in the plantation calendar. During harvest, the cane had to be cut and processed immediately at its peak ripeness. Any delay meant ruined crops and massive financial losses. The plantation owners had to work their enslaved labor force overtime during this period to process the cane quickly. Sharpe believed this economic pressure point would force plantation owners to negotiate. The strikers would demand better treatment, the consideration of freedom, and, most importantly, wages. They wanted half the going wage rate, transforming their status from property to paid workers. Sharpe's plan emphasized passive resistance. They would simply refuse to work unless their demands were met. He believed the economic reality would make violence unnecessary. The plantation owners would have no choice but to capitulate or watch their fortunes literally rot in the fields. To organize this strike across multiple plantations and parishes, Sharpe established a sophisticated network. He chose lieutenants from among other literate enslaved men who held positions of relative responsibility, men who could be trusted and who had the ability to organize others. Johnson, a leader on one estate. Campbell, a carpenter from York Estate. Robert Gardner, a wagoner from Greenwich Estate. Thomas Dove from Belvedere Estate. John Tharp from Haslelimf Estate. George Taylor, who, like Sharpe, was a deacon in Burchell's Chapel. These men formed a command structure that Sharpe used to spread his message across western Jamaica, reaching into St. James, Trelawney, Westmoreland, St. Elizabeth, and Manchester parishes. At secret meetings held after regular religious services, Sharpe and his lieutenants administered oaths to potential rebels. They swore on the Bible to maintain secrecy and to participate in the strike. The plan spread through what historians would later call the slave grapevine, a sophisticated intelligence network that used ship workers, house servants, traveling preachers, and cargo handlers to pass messages across the island with remarkable speed. White plantation owners sometimes heard critical news from Kingston through this network before official mail arrived, demonstrating its efficiency while remaining mystified by what they called some unknown mode of conveying intelligence. But secrets this large cannot be kept indefinitely. Word of the planned strike reached some plantation owners. The colonial government responded by sending troops into St. James Parish and anchoring warships in Montego Bay and Black River with their guns trained on the towns. The presence of military force transformed the atmosphere. The enslaved people of Jamaica understood what those ships and soldiers meant. There would be no negotiation, no peaceful resolution. The plantation owners and colonial government were preparing for violence, and the choice facing the rebels became stark: submit without resistance or defend themselves when the inevitable crackdown came. On the evening of December 27, 1831, 2 days after Christmas, a fire appeared in the hills above Montego Bay. The Kensington Estate Great House, where cane was dried and processed, was burning. From the courthouse in Montego Bay, observers counted 6 fires by sunset in the neighborhood of Kensington, spreading northward. This was the signal that peaceful resistance had become impossible. The rebellion had begun. Fires erupted across the western parishes throughout the night and following days. The enslaved people targeted the infrastructure of the plantation system itself. They burned great houses, the mansions where plantation owners or their overseers lived. They destroyed sugar works, the buildings and equipment used to process cane into sugar and rum. They burned crops in the fields. But notably, they largely avoided targeting the growing sugarcane itself. Some historians interpret this as evidence that the rebels still hoped to work the plantations themselves after ousting the current owners, suggesting their goal was not destruction, but transformation of the system. By some accounts, 16 estates were burning by midnight on that first night, with 50,000 enslaved people suddenly facing the question of what came next. Colonel William Grignon, a prominent St. James lawyer, militia commander, and powerful landowner, received orders to suppress the strike and force the enslaved people back to work. His own Salt Spring estate had been a focal point of tension in December, with a series of incidents that helped spark the uprising. Grignon led his militia toward the rebels expecting easy victory. The colonial mindset assumed that enslaved people would scatter at the first show of force, that they were inherently cowardly and incapable of organized resistance. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The rebels had stockpiled guns and ammunition, and they met Grignon's militia with strong enough resistance to force a retreat. This early victory was psychologically significant. The rebels had faced down the colonial militia and won. They controlled the rural areas of St. James Parish. The rebellion that Sharpe had hoped to keep peaceful had become an armed uprising, and for a brief moment, the enslaved people of western Jamaica held the advantage. On December 31st, recognizing the severity of the situation, the colonial authorities instituted martial law. Sir Willoughby Cotton of the British Army assumed command of military operations. Cotton understood that regular troops alone might not be sufficient. He made a calculated and controversial decision. He enlisted the Jamaican Maroons, descendants of escaped enslaved people who had waged guerrilla warfare against the British throughout the 18th century, and eventually won treaties granting them semi-autonomous status. Those treaties came with obligations. The Maroons had agreed to return escaped enslaved people to British authorities and to assist in suppressing rebellions. The Accompong Maroons from Accompong town faced a difficult choice. They were themselves descended from people who had fought for freedom, but they formed a vulnerable community that depended on maintaining their treaty relationship with the colonial government. They chose cooperation. In the second week of January 1832, the Accompong Maroons attacked Sharpe's forces at Catadupa. The initial engagement went badly for the Maroons. The rebels were too strong, and the Maroons retreated. But they regrouped and gained the upper hand in a second skirmish, killing Campbell, one of Sharpe's key deputies. When Cotton's regular troops found themselves besieged by a large rebel army at Maroon Town, the Accompong Maroons relieved them, killing more rebels and capturing scores of prisoners, including Dehaney, another of Sharpe's deputies. The arrival of the Windward Maroons from Charlestown and Moortown sealed the rebellion's fate. These Eastern Maroons killed and captured several other rebel leaders, including a man named Gillespie. Robert Gardner, one of the last rebel leaders still fighting, surrendered when he learned the Windward Maroons had joined the fight. The military phase of the rebellion lasted approximately 10 days in its most intense form, though sporadic guerrilla resistance continued for weeks in Jamaica's mountainous interior. Approximately 60,000 people had participated in some capacity, making this the largest slave rebellion in British colonial history. The casualty figures tell a story of asymmetric warfare and its aftermath. 14 white people died during the rebellion, killed by armed enslaved fighters. More than 200 enslaved people died in the actual fighting, killed by troops, militia, and Maroons. But those numbers, significant as they were, pale in comparison to what came next. The colonial government and the plantocracy responded to the rebellion with methodical brutality. The aftermath saw approximately 500 more enslaved people killed through what official records called various forms of judicial executions. Between 310 and 340 people were tried, convicted, and hanged or shot. The judicial records reveal the arbitrary nature of these proceedings. People were executed for property offenses. One man was hanged for stealing a pig, another for taking a cow. These were not executions for participation in rebellion. They were executions as terror, designed to reassert absolute control through overwhelming violence. Henry Bleeby described how the courts commonly executed 3 or 4 people simultaneously. The bodies were piled up and taken by enslaved laborers to be dumped in mass graves on the outskirts of town. But many bodies were not buried. Heads were cut off and mounted on poles throughout the plantations as warnings. In St. James, enslaved people were gibbeted, their bodies displayed in the public square in the center of town. In Lusaia, condemned people were placed in carts with their arms bound, ropes around their necks, and white caps on their heads, paraded through town before execution. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who resist. This is the price of rebellion. Baptist missionaries found themselves targeted in the aftermath. The plantation owners believed, not entirely without reason, that the Baptist Church had created the conditions for rebellion by educating enslaved people, by teaching them to read, by recognizing them as preachers and leaders. 6 Baptist missionaries were jailed. A Wesleyan missionary was tarred and feathered. Around 20 chapels that served black congregations were destroyed or damaged by white mobs seeking revenge. William Knibb and Henry Bleeby, missionaries who had not been informed about the rebellion and had not advocated for it, were arrested. When Knibb later testified before Parliament, he told stories about the brutal treatment he and other missionaries received. And notably, the House of Commons expressed outrage that white planters would tar and feather white missionaries. The differential concern for white suffering versus black suffering was stark. The property damage was enormous. The Jamaican Assembly's summary report issued in March 1832 estimated total damage at $1,154,589, which would be roughly $124 million in today's currency. Thousands of rebels had set fire to more than 100 properties. Over 40 sugar works were destroyed. The houses and estates of nearly 100 white planters burned. This was economic warfare on a scale that made the rebellion impossible to ignore in London. The human cost, the property destruction, the very fact that 60,000 enslaved people had risen up simultaneously, all of this demonstrated something the British Parliament could no longer deny. The system was unsustainable. The cost of maintaining slavery through force was becoming prohibitive. Samuel Sharpe had gone into hiding after the rebellion began spinning out of his control. He understood that, as the acknowledged leader, he was a marked man. But he eventually surrendered himself to authorities. According to some accounts, his brother William stood by his side when he turned himself in. Sharpe was imprisoned in Montego Bay to await trial. During the months between his capture and execution, he received regular visits from Henry Bleeby, the Methodist missionary who had been released from his own imprisonment. Bleeby came to know Sharpe well during these visits, and his later writings provide some of the most detailed descriptions we have of Sharpe's character and beliefs. Bleby found Sharpe to be the most intelligent and remarkable enslaved person he had ever met. He heard Sharpe deliver speeches to fellow prisoners, and was amazed at the power and freedom of his oratory. Sharpe appeared to have complete command over the feelings and passions of his hearers. He used his time in prison to continue teaching, to continue preaching, to maintain the sense of purpose and dignity that had made him a leader. Bleby encouraged Sharpe to write the story of his life, and, according to some accounts, Sharpe spent more than 3 months doing exactly that, producing letters and documents including a powerful missive to the British House of Commons. In this letter, he made his case plainly. The beast of the earth, the asses, the cows, the pigs, do not receive the harshness of treatment that we do. Even though we are all the property of the landowner, the animals in the pens are treated with more respect. Their heads are not cut from their bodies and hang upon poles. They are not flogged until they bleed. Buckets of salt are not thrown on their open wounds. They are not bound in chains and placed in stocks. To hold another in chains is against the laws of God. On May 23, 1832, Samuel Sharpe was led to the gallows in what is now Sam Sharpe Square in Montego Bay. A considerable crowd assembled to witness the execution. He walked to his death with what observers described as a firm and dignified step, maintaining his composure to the end. In his final conversations with Bleby, Sharpe had made his position clear with words that would echo through history. "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." He meant it literally. Death with dignity was preferable to a life in chains. Bleby brushed away tears as he turned from the execution scene, writing later about his sorrow and indignation that such a man as Samuel Sharpe should be thus immolated at the polluted shrine of slavery. Sharpe's body was initially buried in the sand on the beach in Montego Bay. His owners were paid £16 as compensation for their loss of property. Years later, his remains were exhumed and reinterred beneath the pulpit of the Burchell Baptist Church, a fitting resting place for the deacon who had used his position in that church to organize the largest rebellion in Jamaican history. The Baptist War sent shockwaves through the British establishment. The rebellion and the brutal government response provoked 2 detailed parliamentary inquiries. Committees investigated the causes of the rebellion, the conditions that led to it, and the reprisals that followed. William Knibb was among 32 witnesses who addressed 8,172 questions from the committee over the summer of 1832, just months after Sharpe's execution. Knibb spoke graphically about the conditions of slavery, telling stories that made it impossible for Parliament to maintain comfortable fictions about benevolent plantation owners and contented enslaved workers. He described Catherine Williams, an enslaved woman who refused a sexual relationship with her master, and was beaten in revenge until her back was a mass of blood. He described the systematic violence that characterized the plantation system. He made Parliament understand that the Jamaican plantocracy had responded to the rebellion with a level of brutality that was becoming politically untenable. The economic argument proved as powerful as the moral one. The inquiries revealed that slavery was becoming increasingly costly to maintain. The threat of further rebellions meant permanent military presence. The destruction of property during uprisings meant massive financial losses. The system required constant violence to function, and that violence was expensive both in monetary terms and in terms of Britain's international reputation. Sugar production in Jamaica was already declining due to competition from other regions. The Industrial Revolution was shifting Britain's economy toward factories and wage labor, making the plantation system seem outdated and inefficient. By 1832, Britain had alternative sugar sources in India, Mauritius, and elsewhere. The economic justification for slavery was eroding, while the costs of maintaining it through force were rising. On May 24, 1832, one day after Samuel Sharpe's execution, a select group of members of Parliament in Westminster's Old Palace called for a committee to investigate the possibility of abolishing slavery. Their motivation was overwhelmingly pragmatic rather than purely moral. They recognized the likelihood of further revolts. They understood that the cost of suppression was prohibitive. They calculated that the system would eventually collapse under its own contradictions, and that managing that collapse legislatively was preferable to facing more uprisings like the Baptist War. The committee's work continued through 1832 and into 1833. On August 29, 1833, less than 2 years after the rebellion began, and 16 months after Sharpe's death, the House of Commons passed the Slavery Abolition Act. The bill made the purchase or ownership of slaves illegal in British colonies with limited exceptions. It represented the legal end of slavery in the British Empire. But that end came with qualifications that revealed how the system continued to protect the interests of the plantation class even in abolition. Rather than immediate freedom, the Act established an apprenticeship system. Former enslaved people were bound to work for their former owners for a fixed term. 4 years for domestic workers and 6 years for agricultural workers. They were required to work 40 hours per week without pay, with only the promise of food, clothing, lodging, and medical care. They could work additional hours for wages to purchase their freedom early, but special magistrates appointed to oversee this system frequently sided with plantation owners. The apprenticeship system was essentially slavery by another name, maintaining the exploitation while calling it something else. Even more revealing was the compensation scheme. The British government allocated £20 million, roughly 40% of Britain's annual budget, to be paid as compensation to slave owners for the loss of their property. This would be approximately £2.6 billion in today's currency. British taxpayers paid this enormous sum to compensate the people who had profited from slavery. Not a penny went to the formerly enslaved people themselves, the actual victims of the system. Samuel Sharpe's owners received their £16 for losing him. Multiply that across thousands of enslaved people, and the total compensation to Jamaican plantation owners was substantial. The apprenticeship system proved even more abusive than its architects intended, or at least claimed to intend. The exploitation and harsh punishments continued largely unabated. Freed people found themselves trapped in a system that looked remarkably similar to the one they thought they'd been freed from. But the resistance continued. People refused to accept apprenticeship as freedom. They agitated, they complained, they pushed back. The numerous abuses committed by plantation owners on their apprentices created ongoing problems that the British government eventually decided weren't worth the trouble. In 1838, 2 years ahead of schedule, the government terminated the apprenticeship system. On August 1, 1838, 6 years after Samuel Sharpe's execution, full emancipation finally became legal reality across the British Empire. The question that has occupied historians ever since is what role the Baptist War actually played in this outcome. Would Britain have abolished slavery without the rebellion? The abolitionist movement had been building for decades. William Wilberforce and his allies had been making moral arguments since the 1780s. The economic case against slavery was growing stronger as industrialization changed Britain's economy. The transatlantic slave trade had been abolished in 1807 without requiring a massive rebellion. Some historians argue that slavery's end was inevitable, that the Baptist War simply accelerated a process already in motion. Others argue that without the Baptist War, abolition might have been delayed for decades. The evidence from the parliamentary inquiries suggests that the rebellion was decisive. The violence of the uprising, and especially the brutal reprisals that followed, made it impossible for Parliament to ignore the reality of slavery. The Baptist War demonstrated that the system could not continue without constant bloodshed. The economic calculations changed when rebellion became not just possible, but likely. The cost-benefit analysis of maintaining slavery shifted dramatically when Parliament had to factor in the probability of future uprisings on similar or larger scales. Henry Bleeby, who witnessed both the rebellion and its aftermath, wrote that the evidence taken before the parliamentary committees made it manifest that if the abolition of slavery were not speedily effected by legislative enactment, the enslaved would assuredly take the matter into their own hands and bring their bondage to a violent and bloody termination. This was the calculation that ultimately swayed Parliament. Not moral arguments alone, but moral arguments combined with the demonstrated reality that enslaved people would continue fighting for freedom regardless of the cost. The rebellion provided a compelling narrative that galvanized support for the anti-slavery cause. The courage displayed by Sharpe and his followers gave the abstract moral arguments concrete human form. Samuel Sharpe's legacy in Jamaica is profound and complex. In 1975, more than 140 years after his death, the Jamaican government proclaimed him a national hero. In 1982, he received the posthumous title of Right Excellent Samuel Sharpe. Sam Sharpe Teachers College was founded in Granville, a suburb of Montego Bay, and named in his honor. His image appeared on the Jamaican $50 banknote until 2023, when it was moved to the $500 bill. The square where he was executed now bears his name. Monuments and statues commemorate his role in Jamaica's history. His remains rest beneath the pulpit of the Burchell Baptist Church, where he once preached. This reverence for Sharpe reflects something important about how Jamaica understands its own history. The celebration of Sharpe over figures like William Wilberforce underscores the importance of indigenous agency in the narrative of emancipation. While external advocates contributed to the abolitionist cause, it was the bravery and determination of individuals like Sharpe that brought the struggle to the forefront, forcing a reckoning with the injustices of slavery. There's a tendency in historical narratives to credit abolition to the moral awakening of white legislators and activists in Britain. The story becomes about Wilberforce's speeches in Parliament, about Christian moral arguments prevailing, about Britain's humanitarian impulses triumphing over economic self-interest. This narrative centers white agency and relegates enslaved people to the role of victims awaiting rescue. The reality is more complicated and more empowering. Enslaved people were never passive victims. They resisted constantly through various means. They escaped when possible, forming maroon communities. They engaged in work slowdowns and sabotage. They preserved their cultures and identities despite systematic attempts to destroy both. They staged revolts like the Baptist War. Samuel Sharpe represents this tradition of resistance reaching a culmination point. His rebellion wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last, but it came at a moment when the combination of slave resistance and economic pressure created conditions that made abolition politically feasible. The Baptist War also reveals the contradictions and compromises inherent in how freedom came to Jamaica. Abolition was achieved, but on terms that continued to privilege the former enslavers. They received compensation. The formerly enslaved received nothing except delayed freedom under the apprenticeship system. Even after full emancipation in 1838, the racial hierarchies and economic inequalities that slavery created persisted. Many freed individuals lacked access to land or resources. They became wage laborers on plantations under exploitative conditions, or they moved to free villages, settlements established by missionaries that offered some degree of autonomy. A peasant economy emerged as freed Jamaicans sought to acquire land and build self-sufficient farming communities, resisting continued economic dependency on plantation labor. But the legacy of slavery continued shaping Jamaican society through systemic discrimination, economic inequality, and social tensions that would periodically erupt into violence, including the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. The story of Samuel Sharpe forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about freedom and how it's achieved. He organized a rebellion that failed militarily. The colonial government crushed it within weeks. Sharpe himself was executed along with hundreds of others. Property was destroyed, but the plantation system survived in modified form for years. By conventional measures, the Baptist War was a failure. Yet, within 2 years, the system it challenged was legally dismantled. The rebellion didn't achieve its immediate objectives, but it changed the political calculus in ways that made abolition inevitable. This raises questions about the nature of resistance and success. Is a rebellion that fails militarily but succeeds in creating political conditions for change actually a failure? How do we measure the effectiveness of actions that don't achieve their stated goals but achieve related goals through indirect paths? Samuel Sharpe died believing, according to Bleeby's account, that he had fought for something worth dying for. He chose dignity in death over life in chains. His statement from prison, that he would rather die on the gallows than live in slavery, reflects a kind of existential courage that transcends the immediate tactical situation. It's a declaration that some things matter more than survival. It's an assertion of humanity in a system designed to deny that humanity. It's a refusal to accept the terms of his own oppression. That refusal, multiplied across thousands of participants in the rebellion, created a crisis that the British Empire could not resolve through violence alone. The fires that burned across western Jamaica in late December 1831 were more than destroyed property. They were a message written in flames. The message said that enslaved people understood their own situation better than their owners did. They knew that freedom was not going to be granted through parliamentary debate alone. They knew that economic pressure combined with the threat of ongoing resistance was the lever that would move the system. They were willing to risk everything to apply that pressure. Most of the 60,000 participants in the Baptist War were not literate. Most did not leave written records. Their names appear in slave registers as property, or in execution records as criminals. But their collective action changed history. Samuel Sharpe gave voice and organization to something that was already present in the hearts of enslaved people throughout Jamaica: the desire for freedom and the willingness to fight for it. Walking through Sam Sharpe Square in Montego Bay today, you can see the monument erected in his honor. You can visit the Burchell Baptist Church where he preached and where his remains are buried beneath the pulpit. You can handle the Jamaican currency that bears his image. these memorials represent official recognition of his significance. But his real legacy isn't in monuments or money. It's in the historical fact that the largest slave rebellion in British colonial history occurred, that it terrified the plantation class and shocked Parliament, that it made the cost of maintaining slavery too high to sustain, and that within 2 years of its leader's execution, the legal framework of slavery in the British Empire began to crumble. Samuel Sharpe didn't live to see freedom come to Jamaica. He died at 31 on the gallows, his body buried in beach sand-like waste to be disposed of. But he died knowing he had done something that mattered. He had organized resistance on a scale that couldn't be ignored. He had demonstrated that enslaved people were not going to wait patiently for white legislators in London to decide their fate. He had proven that the system depended on constant violence to function, and that the cost of that violence could become unbearable. The British Empire prided itself on being the most advanced, most civilized, most humane empire in human history. It claimed to bring order and progress to the territories it controlled. But in Jamaica, as in other colonies, that claim rested on a foundation of brutal exploitation. The Baptist War forced Britain to confront the gap between its self-image and its actions. The rebellion and the savage reprisals that followed revealed the truth that slavery was maintained not through benevolence or natural hierarchy, but through systematic violence. When that violence became too visible, too expensive, and too threatening to British interests, the system changed. Not because Parliament suddenly developed a conscience, but because Samuel Sharpe and 60,000 others forced them to make a choice. Continue the system and face ongoing rebellion, or end it and manage the transition on terms favorable to the former enslavers. They chose the second option, and though the terms were unjust, though the formerly enslaved received nothing while their former owners received fortunes, the legal framework of slavery ended. Samuel Sharpe's execution was meant to be a warning. The authorities wanted his death to discourage future resistance. They wanted the image of his body hanging from the gallows to terrify anyone who might consider following his example. But executions of rebels often have the opposite effect. Martyrs inspire as much as they warn. Sharpe became a symbol of resistance, a man who chose death over submission, who organized the largest rebellion in Jamaican history, who forced the British Empire to acknowledge that slavery could not continue. His life and death embodied the principle that freedom is not granted by authorities, but seized by those who refuse to accept their own oppression. Every movement for freedom faces this choice. Wait for those in power to voluntarily relinquish that power, or take actions that make maintaining the status quo more costly than changing it. Samuel Sharpe chose action. The price was his life and the lives of hundreds who followed him. But the outcome was the beginning of the end for slavery in the British Empire. That's not a clean victory. It's not a simple story of good triumphing over evil. It's a complicated story about how oppressed people force change through resistance, how that resistance is brutally suppressed, and how sometimes the suppression itself accelerates the change that the resistance demanded.